From New York, this is Democracy Now! We're breaking with convention.
I keep thinking about that 25-year-old Indian woman, all of 5 feet tall, who gave birth to me at Kaiser Hospital in Oakland, California. On that day, she probably could have never imagined that I would be standing before you now and speaking these words. I accept your nomination for Vice President of the United States of America.
Senator Kamala Harris makes history by officially becoming the first woman of color to be a major party's vice presidential nominee. We'll hear excerpts of her acceptance speech, as well as President Obama's unprecedented warning that the future of democracy in the United States is at stake if President Trump is reelected.
That's how a democracy withers, until it's no democracy at all. And we cannot let that happen. Do not let them take away your power. Do not let them take away your democracy.
We'll air highlights from the Democratic National Convention and speak to the attorney and activist Erica Purnell and the historian Keisha Blaine. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. We're breaking with convention. I'm Amy Goodman. Senator Kamala Harris has accepted the Democratic vice presidential nomination, becoming the first woman of color to run on a major party presidential ticket. Harris is the daughter of immigrants, an Indian mother and a Jamaican father. She accepted the nomination on the third day of the virtual Democratic National Convention on an evening filled with the voices of women speaking about gun violence, immigration, climate crisis, domestic violence, and more. Former President Barack Obama spoke just before Harris accepted the nomination, warning President Trump poses a grave threat to American democracy.
This administration has shown it will tear our democracy down if that's what it takes for them to win.
Later in the broadcast, we'll air extended excerpts of Senator Harris's acceptance speech and other voices from the DNC. In California, hundreds of wildfires triggered by lightning strikes have exploded in size, fanned by gusty winds and record-high temperatures driven by the climate crisis. Governor Gavin Newsom has declared a statewide emergency and mobilized the National Guard.
We are experiencing fires, the likes of which we haven't seen in many, many years. The totality, when you consider 367 active fires that we are aware of all across the state of California.
Thick smoke from the fires has blanketed parts of Northern California, including the Bay Area, where fires have consumed over 124,000 acres and are threatening tens of thousands of structures. Air quality in parts of the region Wednesday registered as the worst in the world, with residents urged to remain inside with their windows and doors closed. Meanwhile, California's reliance on prison labor has led to a shortage of fire crews. Prison officials have placed 12 of California's 43 prisoner fire camps on lockdown due to a massive outbreak of COVID-19 at a Northern California prison that serves as a training center for prisoners who are paid just $1 an hour to fight blazes. To see our special on the prisoner fire camps, you can go to democracynow.org. The United States recorded nearly 1,300 new coronavirus deaths and 43,000 new cases Wednesday, with Georgia, Florida, and Texas leading the U.S. in per capita infections. The official U.S. death toll stands at over 173,000. 6 months into the U.S. epidemic, healthcare workers report they're continuing to struggle to obtain personal protective equipment as churches, schools, and businesses drive demand for limited supplies of N95 respirator masks and other safety gear. Tests around the country are in short supply. Here in New York City, the head of the teachers union said Wednesday members are ready to call in sick or go on strike if schools reopen for in-person classes before teachers feel safe. Michael Mulgrew is president of the United Federation of Teachers.
The minute we feel that the mayor is trying to force people into a situation that is unsafe, we go. We go to court, we go to job action. That's where we go.
New York Mayor Bill de Blasio fired back, warning the teachers' union against any labor actions that aren't allowed under its collective bargaining agreement with the city.
Look, any union leader who talks about doing something illegal should really think twice about what he's saying.
Mayor de Blasio has yet to commit to a schedule for the fall school year, but has strongly suggested he's prepared to order some classrooms to reopen on September 10th under a blended model that combines in-person and distance learning. New Zealand has deployed 500 additional soldiers to patrol quarantine hotels after at least 75 people became infected with the coronavirus in the capital, Auckland, during New Zealand's first outbreak in more than 100 days. Zambia's 79-year-old vice president tested positive for COVID-19 Wednesday and went into self-isolation. At least 15 Zambian lawmakers have contracted the coronavirus, and 2 of them died of COVID-19. In Europe, Spain, France, and Croatia have recorded their highest rates of infection since ending strict lockdowns earlier this year. Meanwhile, in Sweden, health officials recorded the nation's highest 6-month death toll in over 150 years during the first half of 2020. This week, journalists obtained emails showing Sweden's top epidemiologist pushed to keep schools open so that children would spread COVID-19 and push the population toward herd immunity. He also asked a colleague whether a higher death rate among seniors might be acceptable. In Iran, the official death toll from COVID-19 passed the 20,000 mark, even as education officials plan to administer university entrance exams to over 1 million students. Iran's surge in cases came as President Trump threatened to use a procedural maneuver to reimpose United Nations sanctions against Iran, something European powers insist the U.S. does not have the authority to do. In Belarus, mass protests are continuing more than a week after longtime authoritarian leader Alexander Lukashenko was declared the winner of a controversial presidential election. On Wednesday, European Union rejected the election results, and the EU is expected to soon impose sanctions on individuals connected to the election and the repression of protesters. This is Charles Michel, the president of the European Council.
Our message is very clear. Stop the violence, and we don't accept the impunity.
In Russia, opposition activist Alexei Navalny fell ill and collapsed during a flight from Siberia to Moscow, forcing the plane to make an emergency landing in Omsk, where he was rushed to a hospital and placed on a ventilator. A doctor said the 44-year-old Kremlin critic remains in serious condition. Passengers say Navalny became violently ill after he was photographed drinking tea at an airport cafe shortly before boarding the flight, raising the prospect he was poisoned. In the Gaza Strip, Israeli tanks shelled Hamas positions overnight in a 9th consecutive night of violence as Palestinians continued to launch incendiary balloons into Israeli territory. In the occupied West Bank, thousands of Palestinians rallied Wednesday to protest Israel's agreement normalizing ties with the United Arab Emirates in a deal brokered by the Trump administration. At least 3 Palestinians were wounded as Israeli troops fired tear gas. Joe Biden's campaign has disavowed Palestinian-American activist Linda Sarsour after she appeared at the Muslim Delegates and Allies Assembly side event at the Democratic National Convention. On Tuesday, the Biden campaign attacked Sarsour over her support for the BDS movement, which seeks to boycott, sanction, and divest from Israel over its treatment of Palestinians and its illegal occupation of the West Bank. Biden campaign spokesperson Andrew Bates told CNN, quote, Joe Biden has been a strong supporter of Israel and a vehement opponent of anti-Semitism his entire life, and he obviously condemns her views and opposes BDS, as does the Democratic platform. She has no role in the Biden campaign whatsoever, he said. On Wednesday, the DNC aired a video titled America Rising, Women's Suffrage to Women's March, featuring footage of the movement that Linda Sarsour co-founded. She tweeted in response responds, quote, "When the DNC uses footage of my labor at the Women's March to make themselves seem relevant while throwing my communities under the bus, you can't make this up," she said. Meanwhile, Adi Barkan, the American-Israeli lawyer with terminal ALS, who was a featured speaker at the Democratic National Convention on Tuesday, called the Biden campaign's attack on Sarsour a vile and dishonest statement. Adi Barkan tweeted, quote, "Linda is a fierce advocate for justice and freedom and a leading anti-racist and organizer against anti-Semitism. The Biden campaign must retract and apologize," Adi Barkan tweeted. President Trump has openly embraced supporters of the far-right conspiracy theory, QAnon, describing them as people that love our country. He also refused to question the central plank of the conspiracy theory when questioned by a reporter at the White House.
At the crux of the theory is this belief that you are secretly saving the world from this satanic cult of pedophiles and cannibals. Does that sound like something you are behind?
Well, I haven't heard that, but is that supposed to be a bad thing or a good thing? I mean, if I can help save the world from problems, I'm willing to do it.
Meanwhile, Facebook has removed nearly 800 QAnon groups as part of a broader purge. Facebook also removed several prominent anti-fascist and anarchist pages, including ones connected to the sites crimethink.com and itsgoingdown.org, which criticized the purge, saying, quote, "Suppressing the voices of those who seek to protect their communities from institutional and white supremacist violence is an intentional decision to normalize violence as long as the ones employing it hold institutional power," unquote. The Supreme Court said Wednesday it will hear the Trump administration's challenge to the Affordable Care Act on November 10th, exactly 1 week after the presidential election. The Justice Department's continuing its case to have the Obama-era health care law struck down as unconstitutional, even as an estimated 27 million Americans lost their employer-based health insurance during the coronavirus crisis. A ruling's expected sometime next spring. In Ohio, the Cincinnati Reds Major League Baseball team has suspended veteran broadcaster Tom Brenneman after he was caught on a hot mic making an anti-gay slur. Brenneman's comment on Fox Sports Ohio came after a commercial break during a doubleheader Wednesday between the Reds and the Kansas City Royals. Later in the broadcast, Brenneman issued this apology before handing over his duties to another play-by-play announcer.
I made a comment earlier tonight that I guess went out over the air that I am deeply ashamed of.
In a statement, Cincinnati's baseball team said, quote, "The Reds organization is devastated by the horrific homophobic remark." And those are some of the headlines. But this last headline, the state of Michigan has reportedly reached a deal to pay out about $600 million to victims of the water crisis in Flint. The crisis began in 2014 when Flint's unelected emergency manager, appointed by then Michigan Governor Rick Snyder, switched the source of the city's drinking water in order to save money. The move has been linked to at least 12 deaths from an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease, as well as widespread lead poisoning in residents, including many children. Tens of thousands of Flint residents are expected to be eligible to receive money from the settlement. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. We are breaking with convention. I'm Amy Goodman in New York with Nermeen Sheikh sheltering at home. Hi, Nermeen.
Good morning, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
Well, we begin our show with the Democratic National Convention. California Senator Kamala Harris has accepted the Democratic vice presidential nomination, becoming the first woman of color to run on a major party presidential ticket. Harris is the daughter of immigrants, an Indian mother and a Jamaican father. She accepted the nomination on the third night of the virtual Democratic National Convention, a night filled with the voices of women speaking about gun violence, immigration, climate change, domestic violence, and more. Early in the evening, former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords gave her longest speech since she was shot in the head nearly 10 years ago during a constituent event in Tucson, Arizona.
Words once came easily. Today, I struggle to speak. but I have not lost my voice. America needs all of us to speak out, even when you have to fight to find the words. We are at a crossroads. We can let the shooting continue, or we can act.
Emma Gonzalez, who survived the massacre at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, narrated a video about gun violence.
People affected by everyday gun violence have to walk by the street corner where their best friend, their brother, their mother, their nephew, where they themselves were shot. And life goes on as if we all haven't just watched a loved one die and get put in the grave. The whole point of what I'm saying here is until one of us or all of us stand up and say, I can't do this anymore. I can't sit by and watch the news treat these shootings like acts of God. Gun violence isn't just going to stop until there's a force fighting harder against it, and I'm going to do something to prevent it.
A number of youth climate activists were also featured prominently during the Democratic National Convention Wednesday night.
My name is Catherine Lorenzo. I'm an Afro-Latina, and I'm a climate activist. I grew up in a low-income neighborhood where pollution rates are often higher than wealthier areas, and a lot of kids have asthma. Switching to renewable energy would mean cleaner air, better health, and a steadier income for folks in neighborhoods like mine. Because solar PV installers and wind turbine techs are some of the fastest-growing jobs in the country, and Joe Biden's plan is transformative. He knows that saving the planet isn't just a challenge to overcome, it's an opportunity for a better way of life.
The Democratic Convention also featured a video of an 11-year-old girl reading a letter she wrote to Donald Trump.
Dear Donald Trump, my name is Estella. I am 11 years old. My mom is my best friend. She came to America as a teenager over 20 years ago without papers in search of a better life. She married my dad, who served our country as a Marine in South America, Africa, and Iraq. My mom worked hard and paid taxes, and the Obama administration told her she could stay. My dad thought you would protect military families, so he voted for you in 2016, Mr. President. He says he won't vote for you again after what you did to our family.
The wife of a U.S. Marine veteran was deported to Mexico.
Instead of protecting us, you tore our world apart.
My mom is a good person, and she's not a criminal.
We need a president who will bring people together, not tear them apart. Sincerely, Estella.
That was 11-year-old Estella Juarez. The 18-year-old musical superstar, Billie Eilish, performed Wednesday night at the virtual convention, urging the nation to vote.
You don't need me to tell you things are a mess. Donald Trump is destroying our country and everything we care about. We need leaders who will solve problems like climate change and COVID, not deny them. Leaders who will fight against systemic racism and inequality. And that starts by voting for someone who understands how much is at stake. Someone who's building a team that shares our values. It starts with voting against Donald Trump and for Joe Biden. Silence is not an option, and we cannot sit this one out. We all have to vote like our lives and the world depend on it, because they do.
That's 18-year-old musical superstar Billie Eilish. The Democrats' 2016 presidential nominee Hillary Clinton also spoke Wednesday night.
And don't forget, Joe and Kamala can win by 3 million votes and still lose. Take it from me. So we need numbers overwhelming so Trump can't sneak or steal his way to victory.
Senator Elizabeth Warren, who ran against Biden and Harris in the primary, spoke from an early childhood center in Springfield, Massachusetts. 3 colorful letter blocks stood out behind her. They spelled out BLM, the initials of Black Lives Matter.
We build infrastructure like roads and bridges and communication systems so that people can work. That infrastructure helps us all because it keeps our economy going. It's time to recognize that childcare is part of the basic infrastructure of this nation. It's infrastructure for families. Joe and Kamala will make high-quality childcare affordable for every family, make preschool universal, and raise the wages of every child care worker.
Former President Barack Obama spoke just before Kamala Harris accepted the nomination on Wednesday night, speaking from the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. Obama warned President Trump is a threat to American democracy.
I have sat in the Oval Office with both of the men who are running for president. I never expected that my successor would embrace my vision or continue my policies. I did hope, for the sake of our country, that Donald Trump might show some interest in taking the job seriously, that he might come to feel the weight of the office and discover some reverence for the democracy that had been placed in his care. But he never did. For close to 4 years now, he has shown no interest in putting in the work. No interest in finding common ground, no interest in using the awesome power of his office to help anyone but himself and his friends. No interest in treating the presidency as anything but one more reality show that he can use to get the attention he craves. Donald Trump hasn't grown into the job because he can't. And the consequences of that failure are severe. 170,000 Americans dead. Millions of jobs gone, while those at the top taken more than ever. Our worst impulses unleashed. Our proud reputation around the world badly diminished. And our democratic institutions threatened like never before. Joe and Kamala will restore our standing in the world. And as we've learned from this pandemic, that matters. Joe knows the world, and the world knows him. He knows that our true strength comes from setting an example that the world wants to follow. A nation that stands with democracy, not dictators. A nation that can inspire and mobilize others to overcome threats like climate change and terrorism, poverty and disease. But more than anything, what I know about Joe, what I know about Kamala, is that they actually care about every American. And that they care deeply about this democracy. They believe that in a democracy, the right to vote is sacred, and we should be making it easier for people to cast their ballots, not harder. They believe that no one, including the president, is above the law, and that no public official, including the president, should use their office to enrich themselves or their supporters. They understand that in this democracy, the commander-in-chief does not use the men and women of our military who are willing to risk everything to protect our nation as political props to deploy against peaceful protesters on our own soil. They understand that political opponents aren't un-American just because they disagree with you. A free press isn't the enemy, but the way we hold officials accountable. That our ability to work together to solve big problems like a pandemic depend on a fidelity to facts and science and logic, and not just making stuff up. This president and those in power, those who benefit from keeping things the way they are counting on your cynicism. They know they can't win you over with their policies. So they're hoping to make it as hard as possible for you to vote and to convince you that your vote does not matter. That is how they win. That is how they get to keep making decisions that affect your life and the lives of the people you love. That's how the economy will keep getting skewed to the wealthy and well-connected. How our health systems will let more people fall through the cracks. That's how a democracy withers, until it's no democracy at all. And we cannot let that happen. Do not let them take away your power. Do not let them take away your democracy.
Former President Obama speaking at the Democratic National Convention virtually. When we come back, we'll hear Kamala Harris as she becomes the first woman of color to be a major party's vice presidential nominee. Stay with us. Biden's Dilemma from the soundtrack to the movie Confirmation, starring actress Kerry Washington as Anita Hill. Kerry Washington hosted last night's virtual Democratic National Convention. This is Democracy Now! We are breaking with convention. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Senator Kamala Harris accepted the Democratic vice presidential nomination Wednesday night, becoming the first woman of color to run on a major party presidential ticket. Harris is the daughter of immigrants, an Indian mother and a Jamaican father. This is part of her acceptance speech.
I am here tonight as a testament to the dedication of generations before me, women and men who believed so fiercely in the promise of equality, liberty, and justice for all. This week marks the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, and we celebrate the women who fought for that right. Yet so many of the black women who helped secure that victory were still prohibited from voting long after its ratification. But they were undeterred. Without fanfare or recognition, they organized and testified and rallied and marched and fought, not just for their vote, but for a seat at the table. These women and the generations that followed worked to make democracy and opportunity real in the lives of all of us who followed. They paved the way for the trailblazing leadership of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. And these women inspired us to pick up the torch and fight on. Women like Mary Church Terrell, Mary Cloyd Bethune, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Diane Nash, Constance Baker Motley, and the great Shirley Chisholm. We're not often taught their stories, but as Americans, we all stand on their shoulders. And there's another woman whose name isn't known, whose story isn't shared, another woman whose shoulders I stand on. And that's my mother, Shamala Gopalan Harris. She came here from India at age 19 to pursue her dream of curing cancer. At the University of California, Berkeley, she met my father, Donald Harris, who had come from Jamaica to study economics. They fell in love in that most American way while marching together for justice in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. In the streets of Oakland and Berkeley, I got a stroller's eye view of people getting into what the great John Lewis called good trouble. When I was 5, my parents split, and my mother raised us mostly on her own. Like so many mothers, she worked around the clock to make it work, packing lunches before we woke up and paying bills after we went to bed, helping us with homework at the kitchen table and shuttling us to church for choir practice. She made it look easy,
though it never was. My mother instilled in my sister Maya and me the values that would chart the course of our lives. She raised us to be proud, strong Black women, and she raised us to know and be proud of our Indian heritage. She taught us to be conscious and compassionate about the struggles of all people, to believe public service is a noble cause and the fight for justice is a shared responsibility. That led me to become a lawyer, a district attorney, attorney general, and a United States senator. And at every step of the way, I've been guided by the words I spoke from the first time I stood in a courtroom. Kamala Harris, for the people. I have fought for children and survivors of sexual assault. I fought against transnational criminal organizations. I took on the biggest banks and helped take down one of the biggest for-profit colleges. I know a predator when I see one. My mother taught me that service to others gives life purpose and meaning. And oh, how I wish she were here tonight, but I know she's looking down on me from above. I keep thinking about that 25-year-old Indian woman, all of 5 feet tall, who gave birth to me at Kaiser Hospital in Oakland, California. On that day, she probably could have never imagined that I would be standing before you now and speaking these words. I accept your nomination for Vice President of the United States of America.
During her Democratic National Convention acceptance address, Senator Kamala Harris addressed the coronavirus crisis, naming President Trump directly.
Donald Trump's failure of leadership has cost lives and livelihoods. If you're a parent struggling with your child's remote learning, or you're a teacher struggling on the other side of that screen, you know what we're doing right now is not working. And we are a nation that is grieving the loss of life, the loss of jobs, the loss of opportunities, the loss of normalcy, and yes, the loss of certainty. And while this virus touches us all, we got to be honest, it is not an equal opportunity offender. Black, Latino, and indigenous people are suffering and dying disproportionately. And this is not a coincidence. It is the effect of structural racism, of inequities in education and technology, healthcare and housing, job security and transportation, the injustice in reproductive and maternal health care, in the excessive use of force by police, and in our broader criminal justice system. This virus, it has no eyes, and yet it knows exactly how we see each other and how we treat each other. And let's be clear, there is no vaccine for racism. We've got to do the work. For George Floyd, for Breonna Taylor, for the lives of too many others to name, for our children, and for all of us. We've got to do the work to fulfill that promise of equal justice under law. Because here's the thing, none of us are free until all of us are free. So we're at an inflection point. The constant chaos leaves us adrift. The incompetence makes us feel afraid. The callousness makes us feel alone. It's a lot. And here's the thing. We can do better and deserve so much more. We must elect a president who will bring something different, something better, and do the important work. A president who will bring all of us together, Black, white, Latino, Asian, Indigenous, to achieve the future we collectively want. We must elect Joe Biden.
Senator Kamala Harris accepting the nomination for Vice President of the United States at the Democratic National Convention. She's the first Indian American and first Black woman to be nominated for Vice President on a major party ticket. For more, we're joined by human rights lawyer, abolitionist, and writer Derica Purnell, columnist for The Guardian. She's joining us from Washington, D.C. Derica, thanks so much for joining us, especially as you recover from COVID. Can you respond to this historic address, the first African-American, Caribbean-American, Indian-American to be on, the first woman of color to be on a major party presidential ticket? Derica Purnell.
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me. I mean, all last night we heard and we saw stories from women who were deeply emotional because they finally had the chance of someone who looked like them. You know, so I remember way back in my college dorm room watching President Obama secure the nomination and ultimately become president. And I remember crying, being like, wow, this could be me in the future. So I deeply understand all of the excitement around this woman who stands at the intersection of so many identities. You know, women are excited because she's sharp, because she's witty, because she's a woman of color who's been tapped to serve as second in command. And so, I mean, it's truly a historic moment for lots of those reasons.
Derica, though, I'd like to turn to the piece that you wrote most recently for The Guardian, why Black progressive women feel torn about Kamala Harris. You write in the piece, progressives will have to defend the California senator's personal identity while maneuvering against her political identity. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Kamala Harris, you know, she graduated from Howard University, a prestigious HBCU in D.C. right down the road. You know, as Amy said, she's a biracial woman with Jamaican and Indian heritage. We've seen her break so many barriers. And we know that with the ascension and attention that comes with women of color in office, even walking down the street, but particularly in a public spotlight, it unfortunately in this country has invited sexist and racist and xenophobic responses. And so we've already have seen some of that with the birth of conspiracies that are being used against her right now, which is why last night she spoke to the exact hospital where she was born in Oakland. You know, so that's like one end. The other end is that, you know, women of color, particularly those who are progressive Black women, are also frustrated. You know, they're frustrated by this narrative that the lack of indifference in America ended with Barack Obama and started up again with Donald Trump. You know, are frustrated because of her record as a prosecutor, her refusal to investigate or prosecute police officers, her fight to uphold wrongful convictions, her support of the death penalty as Attorney General. I mean, the list unfortunately goes on. So when she says last night, you know, I know a predator when I see one, it's ironic because one of the wrongful convictions that she fought to uphold was based on the technicality of someone who was serving 70 years in prison who might be innocent. So it's just, you know, unfortunate that you have to protect someone because of their identity and against this notion that their hands are going to be tied because they're a person of color or Black or a woman or a child of immigrants. While at the same time, if you care about the masses of Black people, the masses of poor people, the masses of immigrants in this country, you know that you have to speak truth and be honest about their record and be critical of them in the public spotlight. So that's what we have to navigate right now. Hello.
We're sorry, we're not hearing Nermeen right now. But let me go to Vice President Pence, who responded to Joe Biden's choice of his running mate, of course, Senator Kamala Harris.
No, look, Joe Biden and the Democratic Party have been overtaken by the radical left. So given their promises of higher taxes, open borders, socialized medicine and abortion on demand, it's no surprise that he chose Senator Harris to be his running mate.
Derica Purnell, respond, please.
Oh, of course. And so it forces the Democrats to play political double dutch. So they have to make Kamala Harris left enough to bring in progressives, but also make sure that she isn't pulling the party too far left. And it's an unfortunate tactic that works. So my former professor, Cornel West, says, I'm a part of the radical left. Kamala Harris is a moderate. And so this tactic from Pence is trying to, use this radical left idea to push the party further right. And it's working, frankly. It's why Republicans were able to speak longer than Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It's to affirm that, the Democrats can reach across the aisle. It affirms that the party is not too moderate. It affirms Joe Biden saying that he believes that police should have more money as people are hitting the streets to demand that departments all over are defunded. So this is a tactic that's working, and there's no way that Kamala Harris is a part of the radical left. If anyone's a part of the radical left, it's probably Shirley Chisholm, who Kamala Harris invoked last night, who was one of the first people that was endorsed by the Black Panther Party, right? So the first time the Black Panther Party engages with electoral politics, it's to endorse Shirley Chisholm, And so it's ironic that we are excited about the women who paved the way, but we don't actually talk about the record, or more people, rather, should be talking about their actual records, their beliefs, their policies. And so, no, not by any measure is she part of the radical left. And it's unfortunate.
Well, the DNC's strategy seems to be mostly trying to get conservatives, Republicans, and centrists to support Biden. Do you think that the DNC has done enough to get the support of the more progressive wing of the party?
Absolutely not. The example I just gave of that in the middle of movement against police violence, you have Joe Biden coming out and saying that he believes that police should receive more funding, and it's touting community policing, a failed, vague reform that we know at this point does not work. In the middle of a pandemic where Black and brown people, poor people are dying at disproportionate rates, you have, Joe Biden, doubling down on his refusal to support universal health care. And so all of the reasons why people are hitting the streets, all the reasons why people are suffering, we are seeing a doubling down. We hear, Vice President Joe Biden, rather, decide to continue to not cancel all student debt. So all of these policies that people have been demanding to push the party further to the left, to say that we actually should give a care about the people who are suffering, we see a doubling down on the moderate, positions of the party. And it's just unfortunate.
Derica, I wanted to ask you about the congressmember from New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, being given 60 seconds to speak. In response to that news, AOC tweeted a poem by Benjamin E. Mays. I only have a minute, 60 seconds in it. Forced upon me, I did not choose it, but I know that I must use it. Give account if I abuse it. Suffer if I lose it. Only a tiny little minute, but eternity is in it. It was also a poem that was cited by Elijah Cummings when he once got 60 seconds, the late Baltimore Congress member. This does go to the sidelining of the progressives. And even Adi Barkan, who is the American-Israeli attorney who has ALS, spoke. He was highlighted like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but he, who is known as a Medicare for All activist demanding Medicare for all, for everyone in this country, never actually used those words. And ultimately, yesterday, he came out in support of the Biden campaign's attack on Linda Sarsour. And it was the American-Israeli attorney, Adi Barkan, who is featured, who said that the DNC must retract their attack on this Palestinian-American human rights activist.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, obviously, one of the talking points that often gets overshadowed is, all the selfies that Kamala Harris has with Netanyahu. So she knows a predator when she sees one. It's ironic that that comment is meant towards Trump, but we know that the United States has a long record and history of supporting, violent leaders all across the globe. And so I was very excited to hear, Representative Ocasio-Cortez speak. I was happy that she used words like colonization, and she spoke to the violent origins and violent struggle of this country. And so, yes, progressives are, brought out to come and celebrate and to dance and to show all of the cultural factors of the progressive movement. But when it actually comes to progressive policy, the Democrats are just choosing they continue to fall short, to sacrifice it. So when Kamala Harris in her speech, says, these black women paved the way not only to vote, but to have a seat at the table, she somehow is neglected to mention that Fannie Lou Hamer not only rejected the seat at the table, but rejected 2 seats at the table because she said, we didn't come all this way to settle for the lackluster, opportunity to participate. Shirley Chisholm was highly critical of the lackluster platform of the Republican Party and of the Democratic Party. So it's so important that we talk and we acknowledge that history, because it's not just about them being first. It's not just about voting. It's about the history of progressive women in this country taking considerable risk in pushing this country forward. And that's a tradition that we all should be in.
And Derecka Purnell, very quickly before we conclude, you have 30 seconds. You are at the moment recovering from the coronavirus, which has also been featured prominently. They've talked about coronavirus, the pandemic, during the DNC. Talk about your experience.
Sure. I've been, at this point, thank God that I'm at the end of recovery. The last week has been just a remarkable turnaround. But at one point, I was very, very sick. I had to go to the hospital. I had all of the neurological symptoms. I didn't have any of the respiratory symptoms. I lost my sense of smell, my sense of taste. I was having, terrible headaches and numbness on the left side of my body. I had to undergo, CT scan and blood work and MRI. At this point, I actually can't even smell 100% again, but most of my energy is back, and I'm very, very excited to be able to chase my babies around the house. So it's unfortunate that, the coronavirus is not something that is evil. It's the inability of people to act that is evil, right? It's the long history that has made black people in this country have pre-existing conditions. Those decision-making, those policy decisions, that's evil. We're experiencing the coronavirus the way that we are, not simply because of Donald Trump, even though he is largely responsible. It is because for over 400 years, we have created environmental conditions, economic conditions, environmental conditions that have made people more vulnerable. And that's what progressives are saying no to.
Well, Derecka Purnell, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Human rights lawyer, abolitionist and writer, columnist for The Guardian. We'll link to your latest piece, Why Black Progressive Women Feel Torn About Kamala Harris. And I hope you have a very speedy recovery. Next up, Kamala Harris is not the first black woman to run for vice president. We will speak with historian Keisha Blaine about how that distinction belongs to the journalist and political activist Charlotta Bass in 1952. Stay with us.
People getting angry and taken to the streets. Gonna stake their claim by any means necessary. People grow tired of being abused. Rob them of their decency, they ain't got nothing to lose. Riot, revolution.
Riot and Revolution by Cecile Dukinge. This is Democracy Now!, Breaking with Convention. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Tonight, Joe Biden will accept the Democratic Party's nomination for president after Kamala Harris became the first Indian American and first black woman to be nominated for vice president on a major party ticket. In her historic address, Harris paid homage to the women who came before her.
These women inspired us to pick up the torch and fight on. Women like Mary Church Terrell, Mary Cloyd Bethune, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Diane Nash, Constance Baker Motley, and the great Shirley Chisholm. We're not often taught their stories, but as Americans, we all stand on their shoulders.
As many historians have noted, Senator Kamala Harris is not the first black woman to run for vice president. That distinction belongs to the journalist and political activist Charlotta Bass, who was the editor of the California Eagle for nearly 30 years, one of the country's oldest black newspapers, which covered women's suffrage, police brutality, the Ku Klux Klan, and discriminatory hiring and housing practices. More than a decade before the Voting Rights Act was signed into law, Charlotta Bass joined the Progressive Party ticket in 1952 on an anti-racist platform that called for fair housing and equal access to health care. Bass ran alongside presidential candidate Vincent Hallinan in a long-shot bid, and they lost to Dwight Eisenhower. But she campaigned with the slogan, win or lose, we win by raising the issues. For more on Charlotta Bass and the black women who cleared a path for Harris to be VP pick, as Harris pointed out, we're joined by Keisha Blaine, Associate Professor of History at University of Pittsburgh and author of Set the World on Fire, Black Nationalist Women and the Global Struggle for Freedom, also president of the African American Intellectual History Society. Professor Blaine joined a panel Wednesday at the DNC on progress and the path forward that looked at the unsung heroes of suffrage and black women's political power. Her forthcoming book, Until I'm Free, Fannie Lou Hamer's Vision of America. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Professor. It's great to have you with us. Can you talk about the significance of Kamala Harris being nominated and accepting the nomination for vice president of the Democratic Party and the people on whose shoulders she stands?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I think it's important to emphasize the fact that Kamala Harris is certainly standing on the shoulders of all the women she mentioned last night, but also standing on the shoulders of Charlotta Bass, as you pointed out. And it's somewhat unfortunate that she didn't mention Bass because as you pointed out, Bass was, in fact, the first black woman to run for vice president. And this took place in 1952 in the state of California on the Progressive Party ticket. In so many ways, her exclusion last night from Harris's speech, I think, signals the way we often do sideline black radical politics. And really, just to echo something that Derica mentioned earlier, how leftists in the movement tend to be sidelined. And I'm not suggesting that the exclusion of Bass was intentional, but I do think it is unfortunate and would love to hear more people acknowledging the history and the fundamental work that Bass did long before Kamala Harris.
Why don't you tell us that history?
Well, one of the things that we know about Charlotta Bass is that she truly engaged in what can best be described as pragmatic activism. And I say that because this is someone who shifted, who moved between organizations. This is someone who was literally at the same time that she was a leader in the NAACP, she was a leader in the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Anyone who studies history understands just the complexity of being able to function in two organizations that were radically different, even as they were equally committed to Black progress. And then on top of that, Bass moved from supporting the Republican Party, then supporting the Democratic Party, and then abandoning both of them when she came to the conclusion that they were simply not doing enough for Black people, and not doing enough for women, not doing enough for marginalized groups. And she put up her hands and she tried a new party, the Progressive Party. And I think just really thinking about the ways that Charlotta Bass moved in between organizations, shifted parties throughout her lifetime, speaks to her unwavering commitment to advancing Black politics. She never allowed herself to be tied into one particular group or even one particular perspective. She truly engaged in pragmatic activism, believing that she would do anything possible to improve the conditions of Black people.
Professor Keisha Blain, could you also explain some of the issues with which she was most preoccupied, from police brutality to media stereotyping of African Americans?
Absolutely. She was deeply committed to challenging racism and discrimination. And as you mentioned, even the media, one of the things that she did in 1915, so this is very early in her career in California, was to speak out against the film Birth of a Nation. And she tried to get people, certainly she tried to pull the film from being shown publicly. She was not successful in doing that, but what she did do was point out the problems with the film. She was able to rally the community. She openly denounced the film. And I think her efforts really captured the way that she was concerned with not only, certainly various aspects of Black politics, but she was concerned with how Black people are being represented on screen. And as a journalist, she understood the power of words. She understood the power of imagery. And I think that's just one example of how she was truly, I think, a fierce advocate for Black people. And she was really bold. She confronted the KKK. She addressed police violence and brutality. And her boldness got her in trouble. And it's not surprising that she was surveilled by the FBI, because she was someone who simply did not sit on the sidelines. She confronted every challenge that she saw, and she tried to come up with solutions to fix the problems.
And Professor Blain, why was she branded a communist?
Well, she was branded a communist for the same reason that people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and even Marcus Garvey earlier had been branded as a problem for the United States. She is someone who certainly embraced leftist politics and ideas, and ultimately she posed a challenge. The truth of the matter is she didn't even need to embrace any kind of radical platform to be branded a communist at the time, because in the end, to use the term communist within that context was simply to try to smear someone, to be able to say, listen, this person is not American. And what we know from history is that the people who were branded communists, whether they embrace communist views or not, were ultimately individuals who stood up in the face of injustice, who confronted racism and discrimination. And every time they were vocal, every time they decided they were simply not going to accept Black people being mistreated in this country, all of a sudden they were, quote unquote, a communist.
In these last few seconds that we have, your next book is on Fannie Lou Hamer. Can you talk about her level of activism and the struggle you see now in the Democratic Party of the progressives and the establishment, even as history is being made, with Kamala Harris being the first woman of color to be nominated as a vice presidential candidate?
Yeah, it was truly wonderful to hear Harris evoke Fannie Lou Hamer. I've been deeply invested and certainly in Hamer's ideas and finishing a book on this topic. And one of the things that I think is important to emphasize is that Hamer ran for office. She ran for office 3 times. I think that's important because we don't talk about it. Generally, we don't talk about it. And the reason we don't talk about it is because she was unsuccessful. But I'm of the mindset that even those stories we have to know, and those stories are powerful because Fannie Lou Hamer was unsuccessful, Shalata Bass was unsuccessful, but it doesn't mean that their stories don't matter, and it certainly doesn't mean that we can't talk about their efforts, because what is key here, it's not really about winning or losing.
3 seconds.
It's about how these women ultimately rose to the occasion.
Professor Keisha Blain, we thank you so much for joining us. I'm Amy Goodman with Nurmeet Sheikh. Stay safe.